Welcome to Reward Nerds, the podcast that deep dives into the areas of compensation and benefits. My name is Jon, and I'm your host, and I'm your fellow Reward Nerd. Welcome to this episode of Reward Nerds. This time around, we're not being joined by a Reward Nerd at all. That's pretty odd, but that's exactly what we've been saying from the offset. We want different angles. This time we take the leadership and training angle of things, which I think is absolutely vital. When we talk about, we talk about pay transparency all the time, but when we do, this comes up as one of the main concerns within the rewards community. In rewards, we're brilliant at the numbers, we understand the processes, but are we the best communicators? Are we the best at change management? Can we actually implement these changes? Do we understand how to impact the leaders? No, not the best anyway. So with that, welcome to you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Who are you?
So I'm Stephen.
Yeah.
As you probably can hear, I'm English. I live in Denmark, and I'm the Director of Leadership and Talent. So it's an organization where I'm the owner and founder, and where we make leadership training. So we design the training programs, and we facilitate the programs. And some people may know me as earlier, I had an organization called Human House, along with some other partners, which I then sold before this company. So that's the history. And basically, what I do is try and make sure that employees have good leaders. So we quite often say everyone deserves a good leader. So that's it. So designing programs involving managers, managers, and coaching and designing the whole process.
That's brilliant. I think that angle is superb. Very happy you would join us with this. It has been one of the key things, as I just mentioned in the intro here, that it's a concern, a big concern. The more we talk to rewards people now, if we went a year and a half back, they were concerned about the whole concept of pay transparency. What was it? What did it mean? We're moving beyond that now, of course, luckily, because now we're in May 2025. So, another 13 months or so till live date. And now the concepts are clear. More or less what needs to be done becomes clear. Still a big concern on my side on people's understanding of the timeline. And we're going to talk about that because it impacts a lot of our conversation too. But one of the primary concerns they have, and this has been said for more than a year now, if you have a company with 20,000 people, you have 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people managers. They need to act differently. They need to know what's going on, preferably ahead of time. And they basically need to understand how to act in a different way than they used to. So we're going to be discussing that in quite some detail today. What kind of dilemmas we're seeing. And I think a key thing here is when people are listening in now, they could also be doing that a few months from the recording, obviously. On the one side, my honest opinion is you're all too late, almost. But we can't say that. We can help you, and you can help, and they can help themselves, not the least. But there are things that can be done still, and has to be done. And the question is, of course, with that, what kind of timing are we looking into? What can they possibly do now? How can they start preparing, even though not everything is in place?
Yeah, and I think you're spot on there, because the bottom line is, and now I'm a leadership and development nerd, not a rewards nerd, but I could imagine the rewards people thinking about this now. They're thinking, I got to get hold of my stuff. We got to get the management along. We need to agree upon the processes and what our profile is. And we need to say, all right, so what's the narrative we want our people and our people managers to own? And from that picture, I imagine people are thinking, once we've got that done, then, of course, we've got the information, got the background, and we're ready to train our managers. So similar to calibration, similar to dialogue or other performance management systems, we quite often wait until a month or two before, because that's when they need to know it before it goes. But that's going to go wrong here if they do that. Just from my knowledge outside, I think you've got a lot of challenges with this topic, because it's not GDPR. It's not a matter of just time registration. We're talking about people's identities and the feeling of, do they belong to a company? So I basically think they need to start early. So if we talk about change, then rather than thinking that we need to design and facilitate training late, think of it more as a change process where we need to start early. We need to inform early, even though we have got a lot of empty questions, we've got a lot of answers are missing, but to get people and to get them to buy into the process. So the bottom line here is to open that dialogue, to share the necessity of why this is important, and get C-level involved early so that they tell the story.
And I think getting C-level involved early has been it's been a number 2 point for us. We said number 1, make sure you have decent master data. Otherwise, you have no idea what you're looking at. So do some cleanup there. But of course, you could still start by getting the buy-in from the executive management team and making sure they're committed. Without that commitment, it's so difficult to make any change. And I think that this pulls into that because we have, of course, been talking about this primarily from the rewards angle and saying, make sure you start analysis early to get the first kind of feelings and warnings as if you have, do you have a 2% issue or 9% issue? That's kind of what we're talking about, right? As maybe some of the extremes. And if you have a 2% issue, you could theoretically just fix it with your annual salary review and allocate some percentages. And of course, obviously inform the managers and everyone that from now on we're going to do a few things slightly different. But the reality is, even in the 2% cases, you will find buckets of people that are paid differently. You will find areas where you cannot defend what's going on. You cannot objectively explain what's going on. It could be some old history. And then it all comes from a numbers angle. But even with the numbers angle, there's a fair bit of change that needs to happen, even if they have small number issues. And one of the things that we briefly discussed when we were discussing making this podcast was also the concept of the fact that since more than half of the population in any company is paid below average, which just happens to be the case. I mean, everyone out there listening know that there are more high outliers than low outliers, or more extremes in the high outliers. So you will basically see that if it's 51% or 60%, but more than half of your population are paid below the average. And if you prepare nothing, that's the message they get. More than half of your population is going to get a message that you're being paid below average. How nice is that?
Yeah, that's not good. And that's the important thing, is that knowing that now, knowing that will happen. So why wait? So we can wait till the rewards setup is ready. But the important thing is, how do those managers feel the day it rolls out, the day that they're asked to communicate, the day that they're asked to cope with employees, whether they're at job interviews or whether they're at pay talks, salary reviews, they'll be in a difficult situation. But if you prepare them early and talk about it very upfront now and say, we haven't got the answers, but we know this will be difficult. If we are together and work on it in the right narrative, and if we explain why this is important and where we want to go with this, then these conversations won't be as difficult as they could be. However, we know already now that some of these conversations will be difficult. So why not prepare? So getting the background, getting the notes, getting the timeline is important. But the other thing is more important, so the mindset. So any manager who's told 6 months before, this will be difficult, but we're inviting you in now, and we're inviting you in with management to discuss this. We're inviting you in to be part of this process, and then it can hopefully be good. But we don't know yet. But what we do know is, even if it works in a good way, there'll still be some difficult things, and we just want you to be prepared about that. So, the training can be there, but just to understand, there'll be something like people who will be asked to present to their team. This is how the averages look. They'll be asked, people presenting to their team, or to team members, this is how it looks for you compared to the others, and may get caught out in that situation. Either they're prepared or not prepared. Well, one thing's for sure, those situations will come. So it's not like difficult conversations you've planned yourself. Quite often this will be things that hopefully don't become such difficult. but they could end up going that way. So getting them ready, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, we often say, we even try to say this a lot to the CFOs at the moment, because they're the ones that probably have the biggest responsibility and are least prepared when we think about a group. And what we're basically saying there is the law is coming. If they're prepared or not is up to them.
Yeah.
It's coming either way. And it will be the same, I believe, with the questions from employees. They will be coming.
Yeah.
You need to inform them about this anyway. So whether or not you're proactive or unprepared, or you're actually proactive and prepared, is kind of up to you.
Yeah, you can't.
But the results will not be the same.
Yeah, so you can't hide. You're not going to be. Maybe we've talked about it again with GDPR, where maybe we've thought about keep this quiet, take it easy. We'll do our cleanup, but not make noise about this. Then this won't be the opportunity here. So to turn that around, to be proactive, the rewards nerds, experts need to take responsibility for the change program. So what that means is, in certain senses, that means that they need to make sure that they do their best for the top management, have got the narrative that they can talk into. How could this be good? How could this help us? And how is it we want to be part of this? We believe in this. And that narrative then can roll down in the organization. That's the one part. The other part of this is to make sure that they're comfortable with owning the training, even though they're not training experts, even though they're not training design experts, but to feel confident that, if they keep the budget basically for that part and keep that as part of the change, then they can get people to help them with that. They can have their leadership development team or their learning team or externals to help them. But maintaining that it's an important part, it needs to happen early and it has to be on the agenda with top management, then I think we're in a much better situation. Yeah.
And I keep on thinking of this timeline all the time, and I don't want to stress people out there, but at the same time, if you get stressed by hearing that, then there is no other way. You need to start going with it.
Yeah.
And I do like the message that even though your communication is not ready yet, even though your conclusions are not ready yet, you still need to start talking to your management teams and to your people managers that stuff is happening. And rightly, as you said, this is, for example, the issue with the average situation, that happens anyway. Mm-hmm. So even if you are at a 1% issue company, meaning you have a positive message overall, you're better than most, doesn't change the fact that you still have, unless you pay everyone the same, you will still have more than half being below the average. They may be closer to the average than other companies, but you still have the same effect.
Yeah.
So that way, no, because that's just a statistical thing. So...
But my problem or my challenge with that is my daughter, grandchildren, daughters, women around, when I work with leadership and they want to be leaders or they work with that, then the leadership training, they will always be in the minority at the moment. When I'm doing training, then often men are still correcting them, young men, not just men in my age, but young people are correcting them, helping them, feeling they're helping. They don't need to be helped. So I get that impression that even though I believe that the pay transparency is really moving in the right direction, it has the opportunity of really making change, especially for women. Obviously, it could be other minorities or other groups. But my worry is that even though we get the transparent numbers, even we get the opportunity to talk about the averages, even though we get the opportunity to be informed and to us to be informed and therefore to challenge the situation, which hopefully is a good thing. My worry is that men who get a lower than average will use that and will attack that problem, whereas maybe women who are lower than average maybe find that difficult. Non-nationals maybe find that difficult. People with disabilities maybe find that difficult. So even though it's got the good intentions, then my worry is that leaders, and that's the point, the leaders need to have that narrative from the management of how do we do this. So just an example of that, my guess is that if the average is too high, some people would try to evolve their team and their pay structures so that the averages are better. And what might they do to avoid difficult conversations? They may choose to take some high wage, maybe people with an older age, and do something about that rather than really using this as a positive. And is that good for the situation? Is that good for women? Is that good for ageism? So those are the things that I worry about. However, and because they're guessing, because they don't know what to do. However, if the rewards people take this responsibility for the whole change process, then get the managers, the people managers involved early, share the situation, share cases, share dialogue, reflect and discuss, maybe even train, then I think the opportunity is that the leaders will feel more confident and consistent when they get to that situation in June next year.
My concern is always on this podcast, and whenever I talk to people, we keep on adding things that rewards people need to do. Yeah, but I mean, that's the reality.
Yeah, I know.
Because what you're talking about here is a pretty big ask for rewards. People are not used to owning change, not used to owning this side of the story. They're just simply not used to it. It doesn't mean that they can't do it. It doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. But it means it's uncomfortable. It's different. It requires something. It requires effort. It requires a new way of thinking. At the same time, they're running the annual cycle as they always do, right? So the normal tasks haven't disappeared just because something is called EU Pay Transparency Directive. They continue as they always have done. There's still going to be year-end reviews on the bonus schemes. There's still going to be all of these different things. And at the moment, they're reviewing their job architectures because they're not fully up to par always, or they need to make something from scratch. They're considering whether or not they're going to do the first pay equity analysis here in 2025. They never did it before. How do you do that? Choose software providers for these kinds of things. Choose advisors, what have you. And all of this requires extra. So everything is extra. It's on top, it's on top, it's on top. So we also need to figure out how can we potentially advise people to, how can they spend the time wisely with this? And so with that mindset, I'm not saying that you should recommend people not to do what they need to do, because they need to do it, and I fully support it. Yeah. But what I could be a bit concerned about sometimes is that we end up, like I've had a few really big companies in here lately, and they have bigger resources than most, bigger teams, bigger everything. And then you can recommend the perfect solution in theory. It's still a big task. But if you are a one-man band in rewards, which many are, or a two-man band, then how do you prioritize your time?
Yeah, and I think the key here is not whether they do it themselves, but that they take the responsibility to do their best to put it on the agenda. So they can get people to do it for them, whether that's internal or external. And we keep coming back to GDPR or other situations where we say, so how are we going to do this? For me, the most important thing is that they, through podcasts like this, become aware of the challenge and be aware of that this needs to be on the agenda. Then whether they can do that themselves, I doubt it. Like you say, both being able to design and facilitate and run the actual training, I think, is a big ask. But what isn't a big ask is to just be aware of it and to put it on the agenda. So a simple thing might be, just to make that simple, if we took some real life scenarios, some cases, some dilemmas, how would they look in practice? Then you could do a podcast and share it, or you could send some information out and share it. You could maybe create a learning environment where people discuss it and reflect upon it and say, what would I do? What would you do? And how do we do this? So, and to get those minds and thoughts out of your head and get them out of your mouth so people are hearing it and discussing that. Or you could, almost train and say, so what would the first sentence be? If you had this sentence, this conversation, how would the first sentence sound if you had to take this meeting with this person? And obviously you can roll out more of that, but actually trying and getting feedback and working on that. So the point is, are you going to wait a year until you get that situation with the leaders to do that? Or could you today identify those 4 cases? One could be a job posting, and one of your employees comes by and says, hey, I've seen the job posting, I've seen the average wage, there's something wrong here. Another one could be with your team, you now need to inform your team about pay transparency. Another one could be that someone asking at salary review, they want to have full transparency about their team, etc., etc. Those could be some cases. Why not, and this is the point, why not go back to C-level today and say, this could be something of the high level with change. We could be talking about training our leaders. We need to be aware of this. But why not push it a step further and say, and I'd like to do a very small, facilitate a very small session with you where we can talk about some cases, just so you get a feel of what the leaders in a year may have to face. And how would you do that? And do we think our leaders are ready? So are they going to be the weakest link, or are we going to do something so that they feel it's fair? So the leaders don't be the ones who are stressed and put in it, but actually feel it's fair. And I think that's probably one of the last things I'd be thinking about. If I was a rewards specialist, I'd be thinking about getting my stuff ready. So, but the responsibility for me is to step out of solving and to look at yourself and say, how's the big picture? And can I bring that to the agenda? And that might just be one quick way of doing it. Yeah.
And it comes back to, mentioning this to C-level. What I have seen is that maybe 20, 30% of the top reward professionals, they have direct access to C-level. They meet them often.
Yeah.
They're part of Remco meetings. They're preparing materials for the board in general. They're talking to the executive management team. They're sitting close to them. They're actually part of that sphere. But then there's the rest. They don't have this access. They don't get the themes up to that level. They don't get the message through. They even struggle sometimes getting, airtime with the CHRO.
Yeah.
So with this, they probably also need a few tips and tricks.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, I'm trying to supply people with some good
some
points on that.
Things.
Yeah. Because again, my key message is basically with this is especially, I hope most do not get any resistance from the CHROs. I mean, that would be, in my book, kind of insane. But what we basically see is that many do not get the business case through to run a project on pay transparency at all, which seems it seems absurd. But what is basically stopping it, I think, is the buy-in from the CFOs. If the CFOs truly understood what this meant, I don't think there would be anyone not having a project on this. Again, the project could be small. They could basically say, we think we're in control. Let's double check and verify. And you verify and it turns out you're all right and you're doing nothing more and then just basically ready because your culture has been like that forever. Fine, super. Make, a narrative on that and make sure that you live up to those values and you're good. But I think that's going to be a very low percentage of companies in that situation. Because for the CFOs, in the end, we are talking about making some sort of impact on the biggest cost of the entire company. And if a CFO doesn't care about the biggest cost of the company, something is wrong.
Yeah, and one thing is the cost, and the obviously it's the major cost in many organizations. The other thing is also the vision or the narrative we've talked about. So what do we want to? What are we about? So the cost for me is loss of belonging. Yeah. So if you're thinking of your employees and maybe even your leaders who are part of this picture themselves and are employees as well, we hear plenty of companies that talk about belonging, talk about how to be part of the value, how to follow the organization. Would they be proud telling their friends and family about their work? Would they be strongly ambassadors for their own company? And then we hear some of the big companies as well, where it looks good on paper, but the bottom line, behind the scenes, things are not as good. So the headline for me here is, like, if you just go down to the local fitness center somewhere, they will say, what will they say? Something like, change isn't easy. If you want to get there, you've got to, it's got to put in the fight, put in the effort. So the challenge for me back to these rewards people is saying, if you can't get that direct link to C-level, so what do you do? How do you do that? And that can be the CHRO on the way to CFO, however that is. But to be fair, some of these companies where where the rewards person or personnel have got a strong voice in the organization, typically the big companies, and got the resources for that, they've got another challenge. If they're going to change the behavior and the attitude, the mindset of leaders, they've typically got global or at least remote leaders around the world or around the organization. So they've got a training challenge. How do I make this scalable? We can't just get them all into a classroom. So a lot of the work I do is both face-to-face and online, and how do we do that best? So there's another challenge there. So even though it sounds good and they can get top-level buy-in, the first thing top-level will say is, hey, we've got 2,000 leaders around the world. You can't fly them all into a seminar. So they'll have some other challenges. So my point is, those who don't have a voice, if they get that and work on that, they may, in the end, have a better situation, because I'm guessing that then they maybe get people in a room, get people close to them, at least within their national borders for many of these small and middle-sized organizations. But we're back to the need, the vision of where they want to go to, and the plan. So the need, which can be translated from law and policy, needs to be then translated to, so what does that mean for our organization? And like you say, the finance is one thing, but the vision side of that is, can we use this to proactive? Can this be a positive? Can we use this to attract and to create belonging in the same way as diversity or DI and DIB situations work? That if you just take that out of the equation right now and just think about, can we create a great place to work? Can we create a place where people want to feel belonging? Then that is the big question. The loss of value there of getting the right people into the organization, that's massive. And if you then find your leaders in a year from now having difficult conversations with young talents who are thinking about leaving, then that is a completely different game, because that's a movement. That's like Glassdoor, yeah? It's like LinkedIn. What do we think about our company, yeah? So it's high stakes, if you ask me. So if I was a rewards person, then I'd be saying, all right, what can I do? But at the same time, where can I push it as far as possible to get other people involved in this, even though I'm not the change specialist and haven't got the resources, rather than getting to the annual cycle and being there a couple of months before saying, right, this is going to be difficult training these leaders.
Yeah. Wow, there are many points on that. I love this perspective. And first of all, just to take the first point, I much better like the view of talking about belonging than the CFO angle, so on the personal side. And the reason I'm still mentioning the CFO angle is for organizations that do believe in this whole holistic view of how do you treat your people, how do you kind of look into the belonging and being proud of working for this employer. I think that buys into the CFO angle, or sorry, the CHRO angle in most organizations. It's the culture, it's everything. Hopefully the CEO angle too. Yeah. But the CFOs, if we're going to be a bit stereotypical here, are about the numbers. And if they're the ones blocking things, I want to make sure that we also have a clear narrative for those that just think about the numbers. Because the organizations that always wants to do the right thing, they're probably pretty far in this at the moment. But those organizations that are slightly different from that, or quite dominated by a strong CFO, what I'm basically saying is we have seen that some of the biggest potential assignments that we have been bidding for the past half a year, they have been stopped not because we lost a competitor, but because somebody internally basically didn't buy into the concept of the business case. And I don't think HR were the one stopping it. I think it's a matter of a budget. And that to me is alarming, because it tells me that the CFOs have not understood what this is. Now, fair enough, we could have been the highest bidder and they want somebody cheaper, but we know for a certain fact that those that didn't happen, they just didn't happen. It's not about us versus others. No. So they basically canceled the whole thing because of whatever commercial reasons and whatever they might have. And I think that is concerning, because again, if we're taking that kind of hardcore angle, the not positive angle, if you will, for a second again. Yeah. So you have the CFOs, they're basically not gotten the message, I believe, because we're doing something to the biggest cost and they should be very much aware of that. the second or the flip side of that coin, you could say, is saying it's about risk. Again, if you're just looking at the numbers, it's about risk. And so if risk is what you're looking at, I never heard about a CFO that doesn't care about risk.
No.
Risk is key. So the risk element here, both in terms of potential lawsuits or loss of talent or reputational risk, what have you, but there's a risk element, and there's also a risk element in potential, not only the lawsuits themselves and the fines and everything, but it's also the whole back pay issue. All the individuals that are way off and you didn't communicate well, so they're very annoyed with what they see and they feel that they've been treated unfairly.
Yeah, you know the numbers. I mean, you know the numbers better than I, of course. So how much would this cost with back pay? How much would this cost? So the risk of law or legal costs and taking along that of people expecting and maybe be given pay backwards. I've heard some of the examples. It's like high numbers.
Yeah.
Another way of looking at this is still from a CFO angle, but it's why would you do leadership training in any organization? Some will argue, why do you do graduate programs or talent programs in any? And people say, this is just too expensive compared to the number of talents or the number of leaders we work on. There's lots of other people who are talented in the organization and they can be demotivated. But there's some reason, as a business case, why we then choose to, in any way, sort of to maintain a core development of first-line leaders, leaders of leaders, to make sure that we've got a pipeline. And if you take to the CFOs, then why would they agree to that? That's because they know the cost of not just hiring, but having an intern hire, making sure that leaders who come in don't leave within 12 months or whatever. I've heard numbers like 100,000 euros for the loss of potential value increase. So it's not just the recruitment, it's not just the search, it's not just the period where they're not there, but the actual time to performance and the potential value that could have been gained. We're talking about a lot of money. That's one person leader within 12 months. If we then translate that to the CFO argument here on the negative side, on the money side, then the rewards people, they know more than I do about the amount of money we're talking about, the risk of lawsuits. But could they also talk about the risk of lack of belonging, the risk of their core employees, and many of those who are leaders themselves, it's their role as well. They're being challenged about their level of employment, of wage as well, salary. What's the cost of lack of motivation, lack of belonging, and maybe many of those challenging the status quo? And if that movement moves in that direction before it even becomes an external sort of risk of the way that we are being seen from the outside, that potentially is something a CFO should be aware of.
Yeah, and all of a sudden this turns into a CFO angle. I think that was the intention.
Funny,
yeah. But I'll have one more example on that still, even though our topic is different, but it's still an interesting one, because there is one more risk as well, which is huge, which hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And that's the fact that if you don't live up to the different requirements of the directive, not only do you have all of these things we just mentioned, but there's a huge business risk on top, which is you're not allowed to bid for business within the EU for any public sector assignments at all. Whether that is infrastructure or whether it's something else, you're just going to lose the bid altogether.
That's massive.
That is massive, yeah. Think about the big engineering companies and the big, all of these kinds of companies. They will struggle in such case, right? So that's a huge part of their business. Yeah. So this is going to be a requirement in all kind of EU-wide projects and projects within the EU on the public side.
Definitely. And again, so if we go back to training leaders and preparing leaders, so some of the stuff you're sharing with me now, how can you go from sharing that with leaders, like in the annual cycle, saying this is the process, this is what's going to happen, and you need to remember salary review, do this, that, put it in the box and remember to write, or performance review, you need to record, remember to invite, whatever, to a completely different level of making sure that those leaders realize some of the things we're talking about now, so that the everyday leader who's just got a small team knows that when they're talking or being asked about pay transparency, about equality in their team's pay, they don't think it's just about privacy or just about it, but they actually see the risk here. And if that is made equal to GDPR, then that is going to just be forgotten. But if the seriousness of what we're talking about here is apparent for every people leader, then they'll know how to play their part. They'll know how to own the narrative rather than being told the narrative. And that's so far from each other. And we can talk about rewards nerd, but if you talk about training and learning and design nerding, then you really need to think about how can you get them to own that narrative and not just put the CEO on stage and share some knowledge, or just send out some information for rewards, or do it as a part of the annual cycle. So I see definitely there's an opportunity there to make a big difference for the leader who in a year from now will be asked these situations, these cases we're talking about, these what I call touch points. A touch point is a point where there's a touch and a point. So the touch is I have this meeting, so that could be salary review, that could be when I have to present for my team, that could be if I'm challenged by whatever with my own team. And then the point is, it's not just a meeting at the coffee machine. It might be at the coffee machine, but I've got a point. There's a reason I'm doing that. So if we can get them ahead, if they know what the purpose and the focus for this meeting is, or this situation is, and how to communicate and their behavior and to be listening in the right way, then I would be guessing that they can avoid what I'd call the difficult conversations, the necessary difficult conversations. They'll be able to take that earlier by being involved earlier and being aware of, both the threats and the opportunities in this.
But this is great. This is nerding in a different level. So I love it because you make me super curious, at least on one point you mentioned here, because it's about the messaging again. I've always been thinking, when you have a large number of managers, they're going to be as different from, as anyone else. Mm-hmm. They made it to a certain point, okay, that they have in common. But except from that, they're going to be on any side of the political spectrum. They're going to be having opinions about liking or disliking the EU and directives and all of these kinds of things. So on the one side, a company often wants to have a uniform message, right? This is our narrative. This is our philosophy. This is our company. Please make sure you filter that through. But if you only come with one argument or one direction, then it sounds to me, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but then people will do that with different level of enthusiasm and different level of credibility, and some may not even actually tell that message further because they kind of disagree with it. They're going to act within a certain frame so they don't get fired, but you know what I mean? They're not going to actually push the message.
Yeah.
But if you potentially flavor that message with a number of messages, meaning, you could, as we talked about, if you flavor the message with saying, right, number one, as a company, we think it's the right thing to do. Okay? So that's one message. That's like a simple message. Number two, fairness is good for business.
Yeah.
You come up with a number of these things, and then you have 10, 20, 30% that fundamentally do not believe this is true. But if you flavor that message with additional arguments of saying, and by the way, we need to do this in order to be able to win business in our core sectors. And by the way, this is also potentially, if we don't do this right, it will cost us talent, and you will have to train new people in your team and recruit new people, and we need to do it anyway.
Yeah.
And then people buy into different arguments in different ways.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I agree totally. But the important thing is, and we're repeating ourselves a bit, is that we don't want that to be down on paper and sent to them. We want them to own it and feel it. So one of the things that's really important about leadership behavior and leadership training is people to be authentic, so to be unique. So if there is a company that they work for that has certain values. We don't want them to have different values so there's in conflict, but those values and the way they behave and the way their leadership is unique. So being funny isn't just being funny. There's lots of different ways of being funny. And being a leader in the same way, they don't all have to be old, grey-haired with a jacket on. They need to be, as themselves, because otherwise they will not be consistent. And the worst thing for employees and leadership peers is to see a leader who is not authentic, not consistent, and not takes that true, unique approach to things. So yes, we agree. If there is a law, and then there is let's just say, a private company's interpretation of the regulation and interpretation of their own values and what they want to do with that, then we need to have processes, training processes, learning processes, where people can discuss, where people can translate that not just to their business situation and what's my team and my, how does my team get success, but personally to themselves as well, to get that inside themselves so they feel, hey, I'm proud of this. I don't agree with everything, but this is part of what I want to be, the leader I want to be. So I don't know if it's a segue, but just as a quick example of that, when I talk to leaders, I say to them, you need to be authentic. And what does authentic mean? So, I'm really pissed off. Sorry, I shouldn't probably say that. I'm fed up. I really want to shout at this employer or hit this employer, whatever. And if I just do that, then I'm being authentic. In the same way as if I want to put a tie on or a jacket on or shorts on, I'm being authentic. But what we want to remember and we need to discuss with leaders is being authentic is having the behavior which follows the leader who you want to be. So if you're a leader who feels like hitting someone but want to be a leader who doesn't hit people, just as an obvious example, then being authentic is not hitting people. Being authentic is having the behavior of the leader you want to be. And that is individual. We've all got our river of life, as we call it. Were you the oldest child? What was your first job? Have you been a scout leader? Whatever that is, So how do we become the people we are? The important thing is when we then talk about rewards and we talk about this is going to change because of pay transparency. We think transparency is important. What does that mean for our country? What does it mean for our company? What does that mean for you as a leader? That doesn't stop there. That needs to continue and say, what does that mean for me as a leader, the leader I want to be? And discuss that with the other leaders around you and to take those challenges so that when I do have that difficult conversation, when I do have that employee that says, right, I need to have this on the table, or the employee who's almost crying but doesn't know what to do, and you need to say, I need to help this employee, not challenge, I need to help this employee, then that has to be true. You have to be consistent. You have to be authentic as a person. And I think that's why we can keep going back to our years and the timeline. But for me as a learning and a leadership developer, then it's about the quality of however big your budget is and how much time you've got to use that time wisely. And I think we can design a process depending on what the situation is and say, right, with that given money, given time, but it needs the rewards people to step up and say, right, this has got to be part of the, got to be. I advise C-level or I advise my CHRO or my CFO that this is money and time well spent, whether that's online or face-to-face. So there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of angles in it.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting angles here is that this isn't one of those disconnected moments where you basically just tell, management to filter a message down through the chain and you're good. Because every single manager is also an employee. And as you mentioned, they're going to be impacted too. They're also going to get, well, frankly, pissed off if they feel a thing is something feels unfair. For the first time in their lives, they're seeing, they thought they were paid well. They feel they're paid well. And all of a sudden they see that they're below average. They certainly feel they performed better than average. And now, all of a sudden, they get a different kind of information. Or for the people that are above average, but they've been told you're at the absolute top, right? You can't get another increase because you're at absolute top. And it turns out when you see job ads that the range is going way higher than your salary, even though you're above average. Someone going to say, I'm not sure I trust my boss anymore. This information is new. How come? And you start getting those kind of questions. And I think I really like your view on the difficult conversations, because I think they need to prepare for them either way.
Yeah, and their own reactions as well.
Yeah.
So again, if they've had those discussions earlier, and that's been part of the setup of being aware of their own reactions, because we quite often, especially if it's difficult conversations, we think about this person I'm going to have the difficult conversation with, whether that's a warning or whether that's a change in behavior I'm expecting from whatever, what's going to happen with them? What's their reaction? And again, back to being authentic, what about my own reactions? So exactly like you say, if their own situation is challenged as well, and their own perspective on their situation is challenged, that can become very dramatic, and that can be very, there can be a lot of thought going on there in their own heads. And if they haven't discussed that with anybody, haven't thought about that, and actually normalized it and said, that's not a bad thing, it's okay, don't worry, to the level that they can support the process, then they'll be much more confident when they're taking meetings with other people. Sometimes we talk about which side of the table you're on as a leader, especially first-time leaders. Now you're suddenly a leader for your colleagues, or you're a leader for the first time, and then something's difficult. And when do you sort of then take on the other side of the table and start defending your colleagues? So I think you've got a good point there with regards to how are they feeling, how are they as leaders feeling, and what makes them a tick there. So really good. But again, we're back to, do they understand the process? Do they see their own perspective in the process? And now I'm going to come with something which may not want to hear as a rewards expert. Whenever I'm teaching leadership, then we'd make it simple, talk about management and leadership, and talk about hygiene factor of what wage you get compared to what really engages and motivate people. And I know obviously that's a discussion we always have. And could many of these discussions about wage, about salary, about changes not be neglected, but to be part of a more general discussion? So be put into the perspective that there are many organizations and many jobs where people would prefer a much larger wage, who are working with some great stuff, even though they're getting a poor wage, or maybe accept the situation that people are getting more than them for equal work, whether that's right or wrong, but there's something else that makes them feel they belong. There's something else that engages them, something else that gives them that passion to be at work. So that purpose and passion that they have. So if we forget everything about the hygiene wage, rather than if it becomes a problem, and think about, can I as a leader have a discussion with my team member about pay transparency where I'm comfortable, because it's within a wider context of motivation and engagement, so it doesn't get out of hand, so it doesn't become too dramatic compared to the situation. And that's complete opposite of what we started the conversation saying, that this can blow up. But at the same time, if I was helping leaders, managers to cope with that situation, you need to help them put into the perspective of this manager-employee relationship and what they're representing. Because, there's many organizations where money can't be increased. That's what we've got. If you don't like it, but we'd love you to be here the next 20 years. So how do they motivate people? So those are the sort of things. I know that I started by saying that that's probably not something the rewards people would like to hear, but now let me hear, Jon, what do you think?
I completely agree with the hygiene factor piece, by the way. I think I even mentioned it in one of the previous episodes too.
Okay.
Salary is a hygiene factor, always have been. Yeah. It doesn't drive behavior. It doesn't motivate.
Yeah.
But what it does do is, if we go back to the name of a hygiene factor, that also emphasizes something. It means if something is wrong, it smells. And that's the fundamental thing. We typically use that as the example of it. It's like your deodorant in the morning. If you forget about it, it kind of feels like you're smelling all day long and you can't not think about it. You keep on thinking about it. And that's exactly what it is. If your salary feels wrong, it keeps on feeling wrong. You're going to keep on talking about it, feeling about it. It's going to feel wrong inside.
Yeah, it grows.
And it grows. And you're going to start pitching to your, that's a bad word to say in a podcast, but hey, there we go. But you are going to be talking to your colleagues about it, those that you trust, those that you're close with. You say, I don't feel this is right. And that's the fundamental issue here, because this is going to be about fairness. And the feeling of fairness is a strong one. So the whole thing of sense of belonging, I fully buy into what you're saying. A company is much more than the pay. Of course it is. That's not why you're staying in the company. People talk about relationship to the manager and belonging, with your colleagues and the purpose of what the company and the tasks you're doing and the development you're having, all of these great things. These matter much, much, much more than your pay. But if it feels wrong and it feels unfair, then all the other stuff is at some point going to feel like it's a joke.
Yeah, it's a sign of it. It's a sign of it feeling wrong. Yeah, so it's like a way of registering whether things are fair or not. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, if a company uses the other arguments that you're saying, well, you have this great career development, etc., then you may be thinking, yeah, that's true. It's a great company. But why do they treat other people better than me? Right? So you still get back to that point of saying, yeah, I love all of these other things and understand they can't just raise the salaries for everyone. But why on earth did they pay everyone else more than me previously? What did I do wrong?
Yeah, and if we put that in a big perspective, which you started by saying CFOs or CHROs and C-level, just think about if the organization, an employee, an employer branding to the world, what a great place to work. This is where you can belong. This is where you can have a career. This is where you can feel that you're valuable. And we see many companies having great success of that. Then what would this do to that situation? What's the challenge to do that situation if employees are not sharing that message? So it can be a really important part of the whole picture, and therefore must be important for the CFO and C-level to see. I mean, if we're going to have this approach and we're going to have this perspective towards society, so that people want to come here, then this is just one part and a very important part of the picture. So if we turn that around and said, can we have people who are ambassadors? Can we have intranet? Can we have Insta? Can we have LinkedIn? Can we have employers, leaders, and employees together sharing cases of where they have talked about pay transparency, where they've worked with pay transparency, with colors and pictures and future welcoming new people and respecting the people in the organization? Can that be visualized and shared, and can leaders feel part of that and truly feel that that is something they're proud of? And we can see that in other movements, in other areas at the workplace. So why not here as well? So if we could get to that stage, then this is not just what's going to happen in 26. This could really be something that could turn the reputation around for some companies going forward, and it feel good as well. Yeah.
And I think for that, I really want to be practical in these podcasts too, because there's not a single thing you're saying I could disagree with. That's great. Yeah. But I also know that you could say the capacity of the rewards teams are limited. Yeah. And their influence sometimes, unfortunately, is also limited. And they're not used to working with the change teams or working with whoever is actually helping in these cases.
Yeah.
So that in itself is a bit of a struggle. I talked to a large company yesterday around exactly this issue, where they're kind of foreseeing issues with the change team because the change team is fully booked the next 2 years. That's the message. And if the change team is booked the next 2 years or 1 year, whatever, there could be big changes in the organization, full reorg, what have you. Something big going on, or an IPO going on, or something big that happens, which means that the resources they have in the change team, which may also be scarce, they're booked.
Yeah,
they're done, and they have nothing to do with this project. So how do you kind of tackle that? Because on the one side, you can't just steal them you don't have that kind of power and authority.
No.
And often you don't get the budgets to buy this externally if you have internal resources, and they have their way of doing it.
Yeah.
So do you have any tips to the people listening out there that know deep inside they can't just get extra budgets? How do they deal with this?
Yeah, and we talk obviously about big organizations where the change people they're booked for other things, but just as important, it could be small, medium-sized companies where the change team is one person in internal communications or someone who's got to do a bit of social media. And we get back to basically the same again. If you haven't got money, what can you do? So in the same way as wage, if you haven't got more to give them, so how can we motivate them? And I think the thought process is the same here. So just to make that very basic, if you have someone from internal communications who is involved in this or has been on a course or training or close to this one way or other and has it in the interest, they might be looking for good ideas for the internal communication. So can that be just by word of mouth, just by keeping it down to basics of, right, can I, with my team, just by spending maybe half an hour at some point now, try and talk to a few communications people, internal communications or social media, if we've got some brand people, about is the potential here by building on this that we can then get that out to other people, get some ambassadors, get that shared. So the way I can think about it is if you think about leadership programs, we need new people for next year's leadership program. All right, let's talk to some of the people on last year. Let's talk to some of the HR business plan. Let's talk to some of the managers who've had people on it. Could we have some stories? Can we talk about this? But what it demands is that you are comfortable opening that process, even though you know what the content. You don't know what the content is. You don't know whether it's 2% or 9%. You don't know whether it's going to be problems or fun. But the important thing is then it's not just positive, but it's valuable to get that out. And if then comms people can get involved, that could be one group. Like you said, it can be change, can be other groups. HR business partners can be another group. And I'm sure there's other groups So my point is that you need to be an ambassador yourself, and that doesn't have to be put into Excel sheets or structured ways. That can be done pretty much, one-to-one, really.
But you still need executive team buy-in, though, right?
Yeah, but then that's not you doing it, is it? Yeah. So if you get hold of the intern comms say, hey, that's a good idea, they would never go ahead with that unless they got check-in.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So you don't have to check. So if you get hold of leadership training, L&D, intern communication, change people, whatever that, then you can't take responsibility for everything. But what you can say to them is, this is the process. We need that help. We need those resources. We will check in to our C-level to make sure we're doing as we should. Then can we work together on that? So you obviously don't just run, but you check with yours. And if they're as professional as your rewards people, then they would be listening to the business, not just listening to C-level or just listening to HR, business partner, or talent or recruitment, talent acquisition or recruitment. They will then be listening to what does the business need. And in my world, that means what do the leaders in the business need to have success with this? Because that's when C-level listen. If they're going to have middle and middle top leaders left to themselves in a year's time, stressed, worried about everything else, and now they have to do this, then we'll be looking back to the rewards people saying, couldn't you have told us about this before? And that's unfair, but that might happen. Yeah. So get these people, intern communication people or whoever it is, involved, hopefully interested, but then make sure that they go back to their, go through their systems as well.
Brilliant. So I think we've more or less been around the whole block with this now. Any key points that we are missing to kind of highlight here?
No, only that it sounds easy. And like you say, a lot of it is maybe right here, it might sound like it's high level. So sometimes they say it's like sport, like football or whatever. So everyone knows about it, but it's difficult to actually get success with it. So in the same way that I would be guessing a lot towards the rewards nitty-gritty and the details behind it, but still got a feeling that this is probably the way to go, then if I turn that around to your listeners, then I think that they just need to be mindful of it needs the right support to make the right design in the given situation. And that doesn't mean they have to have a great big budget or a lot of time. It means being mindful about the business case and the resources around that, and not being too over optimistic about the situation. So do the best in the given situation and get hold of whether that's their own learning people or whoever it is to support them on that, but not to say, oh, that's too big and not do anything about it.
Great. And Stephen, you're supporting people or organizations rather, primarily throughout the Nordics. You're obviously British.
Yeah. So I've got a typical an Anglo-American approach. So I'm supporting people quite often because I'm living in the Nordics. Then either it's with the Danes and Swedes and Nords and Northern Europe, and quite often it's either global companies that have their offices or their factories around, or it might be the opposite. It could be Nordics going global, and I think that's typically where I'm invited to do my bit. And again, the headline for me is leadership and leadership preparation, leadership training, leadership coaching. That's where it is, and a lot of that is not just about facilitating, being the facilitator and training facilitators. It's training the training designer or training the learning designer, and I think that's an issue that's it's really important. So yeah, that's where I do my business.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen. It was a huge pleasure to get these different perspectives on as well. Thank you so much for that. That was a very different angle, not reward nerding, but actually leadership training nerding. And I think there's some really key points there to us reward nerds out there. You have to take some ownership in this in one way or the other, but you don't need to do everything yourself. So thank you so much.